We're gonna go to Thanksgiving.
I am on the, stop. I'm on here now.
Oh,
Good evening, everyone. We're just waiting for a couple more people to sign in and then we'll start. Good evening. Hi, everyone. It's 6 o'clock. We'd like to start our meeting. Welcome to our second Zoom meeting for 2022. Tonight, we'll be sharing information on the pilot study, which evaluated green sand plus's effectiveness in removing manganese. Our engineer, Robert Ferrari of Northeast Water Solutions, and his staff have gathered enormous amounts of data in September and taken months and months to weeks and weeks to analyze. He will describe the process and the results. Also included in the study was a review of the short-term means for reducing disinfection byproducts, HAA5s, which we're all familiar with. A question and answer period limited to tonight's topic will follow the presentation. This PowerPoint presentation will be available on our website tomorrow. And once the final report on the pilot study is submitted to Mass DEP, we will put that on our website as well. Thank you, and welcome, Bob.
Well, good evening. Thank you, Jim. And I'd like to introduce myself to the all the folks who are participating. My name is Bob Ferrari. I'm the president of Northeast Water Solutions, also the chief engineer, public water system operator. We were retained by Housatonic Water Works company to evaluate removal of manganese from the water supply, and we did a design of a manganese treatment process using the green sand filtration methodology. We submitted that detailed proposal to Mass DEP. They approved it. We executed the pilot plant. We installed equipment at the waterworks facility, and so we were treating a stream to the storage tank and distribution system. So it was the water that you would be receiving, and we ran this pilot plant for several weeks. And we compiled, as Jim mentioned, a tremendous amount of information, and we've gone through most of it. The pilot plant report that will be submitted shortly to Mass DEP. Jim, if we could move to the next slide, please. Just a quick recap. For those of you who participated in the meeting last summer, a few of the slides may look familiar. The system serves approximately 1,400 people through 824 service connections. The average water demand on a daily basis is 107,000 gallons. The watershed, this is obviously a rural watershed, and most of the drainage area within the watershed is principally undeveloped. Long Pond is generally a very high quality water source. However, there have been periods when there is somewhat elevated manganese in the water. Historically, this has happened in the summertime into the fall, and it seems to be happening kind of cyclically, or cyclical occurrence. The treatment process includes, and it has for a long time, probably close to 100 years, since like the 1930s. Slow sand filtration. It also has chlorination for disinfection. Chlorine is in the form of sodium hypochlorite, is the only chemical added to the water. There's a chlorine contact tank, and there's a nominal 1 million gallon standpipe water storage tank. And from the storage tank, the water discharges into the distribution system. So it's a gravity-based system, and the piping is approximately 16 miles of pipe. That ranges up to 14 inches in diameter. Of course, our concern both to the users as well as to the waterworks company, and people were very concerned about it, and so part of this effort is to make improvements that will help alleviate that problem in particular, as well as the presence of manganese in the water. Next slide, please, Jim. This is a little graphic presentation of the treatment system. On the left side, you can see Long Pond. There's a gravity flow into the slow sand filters. I'd like to point out, slow sand filtration is a treatment process that has literally been used for thousands of years. What's worth is evidence that this was being used by the ancient Greeks and Romans. So again, several thousand years ago. It's very effective. There's an underflow from the filters. This is the filtered water. Sodium hypochlorite is metered in the pipe that then discharges into the chlorine contact chamber. That chamber, by the way, has approximately 100,000 gallons of volume, so you have a detention time in there. There's a pumping system that then transfers the water to the standpipe tank, which is a little bit up the hill from the treatment plant. The system monitors pH, turbidity, and the chlorine residual after the chlorine contact chamber, and again coming out of the standpipe tank going into distribution. We basically added in the green sand filtration pilot plant downstream from the pumps. Okay, so as I said before, that was to enable us to take a stream of the water that was actually being discharged to the standpipe tank and then into the distribution system. We want to experience exactly the conditions and the water characterization as it was being provided to the community. Manganese treatment using green sand filtration. This process has been around for since the early 1930s, and the specific variant of the process we call the continuous regeneration process has been in use since approximately 1960. So this is a well-established process. Manganese green sand was originally it's a natural zeolite mineral. The synthetic version, which is called green sand plus, takes silica sand, which is essentially beach sand, puts a manganese dioxide coating on it, and that that coating it's got a catalytic capacity to oxidate dissolved manganese as well as iron in the water. And then once it's oxidized, it can be removed by filtration. There's minimal iron in the water discharge from the slow sand filters, but it would, if there's any iron in the water, it will also be removed in the green sand filter. This process has no impact on the pH of the water, on taste, on odor. No impacts there whatsoever, and it integrates very well into the existing treatment process. Next slide, please, Jim. This system, we used a triplex filtration system. There was three filter vessels and different hydraulic. These are smaller pilot scale units. They're 10 inches in diameter, and they're downflow. So the filtered and chlorinated water would enter through the top of the vessel, and then there's an under-drain collector in the bottom of the vessel that would collect the filtered water and discharge it out. By the way, the water was not discharged into the distribution system. It was discharged. It had a separate discharge, basically out into the lagoon system. So I don't want folks to think that you were getting water from a treatment system that hadn't been yet approved by Mass DEP. Even though we were quite confident it would work, we couldn't recombine the treated water with the water being discharged to the community. Next slide, please, Jim. The purpose of the pilot plant, we want to assess a range of operating conditions and variables. For example, changes in everything from the manganese content in the water to the chlorine dosage going in, to hydraulic loading rates, the flow rate through the filter, and the loading rate upon the filter media. We want to go through many operating cycles. You can get any filter to work good on one operating cycle. We ran many cycles where you run for a period of time, and then you backwash the filter, and then you repeat the cycle. And we had to do that many times because a key aspect of filter performance is if you're getting effective backwashing and flushing out of the accumulated manganese solids that are captured within the filter. We were looking for a consistency of performance. We established a standard we wanted the treated filtered water to have less than 0.01 milligram per liter of manganese in the water. Just so everybody understands, the water quality limit, and this, by the way, is throughout the United States as well as in Massachusetts, is 0.05. So we basically were at 1/5 of the limit is what was our target. We wanted to be at 0.01 or less. We developed a very substantial performance database, and we need this information to support the final design, the full-scale design, and of course for review and approval by Mass DEP. There's other considerations, and this is very important. We had to evaluate the impact of this process on disinfection byproducts, and we'll discuss those later on. Some of you may be familiar with them or have heard of them before. That's a byproduct of chlorination of water. Of course, we were evaluating the overall finished water quality. It's not just the manganese, but it's what else is in the water. Was anything else being affected? And then we also have to determine what's the optimum means to integrate into the Housatonic Water Works company system. So next slide, please, Jim. We went through a lot of what we call validation. Again, as I said earlier, through multiple filter operating cycles, we had to validate for the effluent manganese. And again, our goal actually was non-detectable, but we used as validate how much residual chlorine was remaining, because we have to maintain a certain minimum concentration to achieve the required 4-log chlorination. But that also can have an effect on disinfection byproducts. We're looking at loading rates, cycle durations, and a whole bunch of other parameters, differential pressures across the filters, et cetera. Next slide, please, Jim. So what are the results? We've probably generated over 100 tables and charts. We're not going to attempt to show them all to you. I've selected a handful. When you look at this slide, you're probably saying, "Oh, I see a bunch of triangles and dots on a graphic presentation." But this illustrates a couple of very important points. If you look at roughly, the bottom horizontal line of the chart, that's the finished water. That's the manganese concentration in the finished water. But above that, you see a lot of these red triangles and some red and yellow triangles and a lot of green oval dots up there. That's the manganese concentration that's in the water, the untreated water coming into the pilot plant. The dots at the bottom, on the bottom line, basically the 0 line, that's the water going out. What the intent of this was to demonstrate that under virtually all conditions that we evaluated, whatever the level of manganese was coming in the water discharge from the slow sand filters of the manganese, under all operating conditions that were evaluated. One other thing I will point out is that this chart presents both the field test data and the analytical results from our laboratory testing. Every day we send samples to a certified analytical laboratory. We augmented that with field testing. Now, this is also a certified methodology, but it's a little different methodology than the laboratory would use for the obvious reason we're out in the field, so the results tend to be slightly different. The triangles on here, those red triangles, that's the laboratory results, and then like the green ovals, that's the field test kits. So you can see we got a little higher numbers as far as the concentrations of manganese in the field testing, which is why we validate with analytical laboratory wet chemistry. But overall, this graphic presentation demonstrates that we were basically achieving non-detectable or close to non-detectable manganese in virtually every filter run. I think with one exception, every filter run had non-detectable or very close to non-detectable results, easily meeting our water quality objective criteria. Jim, next slide, please. What this graphic presentation demonstrates is this is the chlorine demand in the water that's occurring within the green sand filter. Typically, the water we were receiving had a chlorine residual in it of approximately 1.6 milligrams per liter. What you see on here is at the far left side of this graphic, it looked like we had a very high chlorine demand. This is going through the filters, what was being consumed in the filters. The reason for this is because we had pre-regenerated the green sand filters with a hypochlorite soak. However, it's not necessarily 100% effective. So what was happening, the first day or so of the filter system operation, we were consuming chlorine in fully oxidizing the green sand media. Once we got past that, we started on September 14th at about 1 o'clock, 1:30 in the afternoon. Once we got past that, you see that we're consuming less and less chlorine within the green sand. And in fact, once the system really stabilized after the latter part of the first week, we were typically using between 0.2 milligram per liter and maybe 0.6 or 0.8 milligrams per liter as far as how much is being consumed. That's important because that gives you critical information relative to how high a dose do you need to have upstream of the green sand, and what's your expectation as far as what could be going into the million-gallon water storage tank, and will you be able to maintain your required 4-log chlorination? Okay. By the way, if you're not familiar with that term, 4-log chlorination, what that means is that's an expectation or a goal of 99.99% kill or inactivation of pathogens and viruses in the water. Okay, that's why it's called 4-log. It's basically 0.9999. So that's what Housatonic Water Works company has to maintain in the water as far as disinfection performance. So we have to be sure we have enough chlorine left in the water to accomplish that. Okay, this demonstrates that once the system fully stabilized, and there is variability in the chlorine demand going through for a variety of reasons, because the water characterization going into the filters is not uniform. It is going to be variable. Okay, it can vary in the course of a day. It can vary day to day, week to week, because it is impacted by the environmental conditions out there in the watershed. So we have to keep that in mind. There's variations in the raw water characterization coming into the plant. Next slide, please, Jim. What this slide presents is this is a comparison of the effluent, the treated water manganese concentration compared to the hydraulic loading rate. And this is an important consideration. When you're using media filters, and a green sand filter is a version of a media filter, it's a granular media, you evaluate them on the basis of gallons per minute per square foot of filter bed area. That's cross-sectional area, the surface of the bed. And we evaluated a range of about 3.5 gallons per minute per square foot, up to about 7.5. And this is important because the hydraulic loading range can affect filter performance. So we want to assess the full range. Now, if you look at this graphic, the reason you see 3 different colors for those dots is because the blue, the yellow, gold, and the gray, they represent the 3 different that we used, which were operating under different loading conditions. What you can see is that for the most part, we were getting results. And again, this is with field monitoring data. This isn't the laboratory data, okay? The reason we're using the field data is because we had a lot more data points, okay? And then what we do is at some point we'll go through a correction relative to the laboratory data, which is a little bit more accurate. And typically shows, as I said, non-detectable results. But what you can see here is that in the vast majority of the cases, regardless of the loading rate, we did achieve our desired goal of between non-detectable and 0.01. We had a few that were higher, and that's why it's important to do laboratory analysis, okay, to further validate the data. As I said, we had that one high data point that Jim just pointed to with the cursor. That's an outlier, but we have to take that into consideration. Just so you know, this filter, myself and one of our other operators, started the filter system up the first day, and one of our operators, his name is Sean Murphy, was there, with the exception of the middle weekend, was there every day, and he was monitoring the system throughout the day, taking a lot of samples, documenting a lot of operating data. We have thousands and thousands of data points of a number of different variables, and Sean did do a very good job. By the way, he's a Class 3 Massachusetts operator, certified. water operator, just what it's worth. But again, this shows that we had very good performance over the full range. And by the way, the water quality limit, just to point this out, is 0.05 milligrams per liter. And as you can see, with the exception of that one outlier, every other, even with the field data, every other operating data point, the finished water quality, the vast majority were still, for the most part, around on the 0.01 or lower. And this is again with the field data. So the system can operate under a range of loading rates. And this is important because you're not going to use this in a full-scale system. You're not going to use a single filter. You're going to have, right now, we're considering either a triplex or a quadruplex filter system, but you need to understand what your effective operating range can be from a hydraulic loading standpoint to know, well, when should we have 2 filters online or 3 filters online, for example, of a given size. So this is very important information, and also to assess, if you're overloading hydraulically a filter, because that's not a good thing to do, and you'll get breakthrough of a filter, and you definitely don't want that to occur. So you've got to keep very careful control of your hydraulic loading through filters. Jim, if we could have the next slide, please. What this slide shows, and this is, I think this is the last graphic that we have here. This is our removal efficiency versus the hydraulic loading rate. And so what you can see is on the left side of this graph, it's the manganese removal efficiency. Obviously, you want to be as close to 100% as possible. Across the bottom, that's the hydraulic loading rate, and that was presented also in the previous slide. What you can see here is that with a couple of exceptions, virtually our removal efficiencies range from 90 to 100% removal. And by the way, again, this is with field monitoring data. If we showed you the laboratory analytical data, the vast majority would be 99 to 100% removal. But again, the field data, it's an approved methodology, and again, it allows us to take a lot more samples. In a lot of cases here, you've got multiple dots sitting on each other, so you can't see how many samples were actually taken. But again, this shows very good performance. And this also lets you see that we actually used a pretty broad range of loading rates, again, from about 3.5 gallons per minute per square foot to about 7.5, or 7 3/4. And the good news is that the performance was pretty much the same across that full range, which is actually very good news. That really demonstrates the effectiveness of the process relative to consistent removal of manganese. So, Jim, if you want, we can go to the next slide, please. This is our immediate team. I'm sure many of you know. I'm on the left. Sean Murphy, who spent several weeks out in Great Barrington, he was the fellow who was there every day. And then, of course, Fred is there on the right. Okay, the boss is there. So that was our team. Behind them, you can see the filter vessels that we used. There's 3 of them. Each one had a dedicated controller. We had fitted up, the piping is kind of behind the controls. You can see a little bit of it. But we were that's right inside the waterworks facility adjacent to Long Pond. So, next slide, please, Jim. This is another photograph. This is 2 samples of water. On the left, the cup on the left is the water before treatment. You can see it's a little bit discolored, and the one on the right is the water after treatment, and you can see that there's no discoloration. What that is really indicating is that, and these cups were left there for a while, so if there was any natural aeration, that if there were any metals, any iron or manganese in that water, particularly iron, you'd see it oxidize from oxygen exposure, and that's why you get that little bit of a slight discoloration in the left-hand sample. That's the untreated water. So excellent performance. This is just a visual. It's a simple visual, but it actually gets the point across of how effective the process was. And we actually did visual checks and took photographs of it every day. just, as a sanity check. Visual counts. And, as you all know, there have been periodic concerns and complaints because there's been discolored water at various locations in the distribution system. The best thing we can do here at the treatment plant is if we can maximize removal of manganese as well as iron and other materials, other suspended solids, that maximizes the water quality going into the system. So that obviously enhances the water, the overall water quality, including the aesthetics. Again, depending on flushing of pipe mains and things like that, you can accumulate solids within distribution, but at least the water going in will be optimum quality from the standpoint of solids and iron and manganese. Next slide, please, Jim. Wanted to go over disinfection a bit. There's a long history to disinfection and studies that were done. Jim put some of them up here. There's actually, again, evidence that people were using various methods of disinfection thousands of years ago, believe it or not. And even several hundred years ago, technologies began getting developed to either filter water or disinfect water. There's many instances of epidemic outbreaks that were related to water quality, sanitary conditions. So the long and short of it is that, it was ultimately determined that we, for public health purposes, a lot of the substantial number of systems in this country use chlorination. The vast majority of them do in this country use chlorination or some variants of that to provide disinfection, and it's to protect public health. The water quality, for what it's worth, the water quality in the United States and Western Europe tends to be far better than the water quality in the rest of the world. Okay, that's the reality of life. The United States, Canada, and Western Europe, we have water quality that's an understanding of what a lot of the issues are, the public health issues, which is why when you travel to other countries, you're often told don't drink the water or only drink bottled water, because our immune systems can handle a lot of the viruses and pathogens that may still be present in water in countries that don't operate to the standards we have here. That's not me being arrogant. That's the reality of life. Having been all over the world doing this work, I've gotten sick a few times. It's not fun. So, but this is this history kind of illustrates that a little bit. What are disinfection byproducts? Well, how do they occur? Water, particularly from a surface water source, will contain what's called natural organic matter, or NOM. When you expose organic marine-based disinfectants, and by the way, at the plant they use sodium hypochlorite. They don't use 12% or between 12 and 15%. But when chlorine reacts with certain organic materials, you can create disinfection byproducts. Okay, it's a natural outcome of the chemical reactions. It doesn't happen with all organic matter, but it happens with some. And again, there's often seasonal variability to this, because at certain times of the year, there's more organic material in the water than at other times of the year. And again, it's just because of the growth and life and death cycles of organic, whether it's vegetation, or organisms, in the water. There's a lot of factors that come into play here. Okay, next slide, please, Jim. There's two categories of disinfection byproducts: total trihalomethanes. The acronym is TTHM, and then haloacetic acids, and the acronym there is HAA5. Again, this occurs when chlorine-based disinfectants react with naturally occurring organic matter. It'll be very variable, as I said before, and also can be impacted by things like the type of the disinfectant you're using, the concentration, and also the contact time, as a matter of fact. Then the risk of illness from that you might have in and otherwise untreated surface water, and even some groundwater sources that haven't undergone disinfection. Disinfection byproducts exposures and limitations are based upon lifetime exposure, not a one-time exposure event, but lifetime exposure. So we keep that in mind also. Now, again, we want to comply with the disinfection byproducts water quality requirements, but again, the public health risk of, say, pathogens or viruses that might be in untreated water are far greater than the public health risk of exposure to disinfection byproducts. But again, I want to stress, Housatonic Water Works company, and certainly myself and my team, working with Jim and Fred, want to make sure that disinfection byproducts are at the minimum level possible. Based upon the long pond being the water supply. So, Jim, next slide, please. The maximum contaminant level for TTHMs is 0.08 milligrams per liter, or that also translates to 80 parts per billion. That's billion with a B. On haloacetic acids. That maximum contaminant level in water is 0.06 milligrams per liter, or 60 parts organic matter, being the precursor material that can react with chlorine and create disinfection byproducts. We typically use total organic carbon as an indirect indicator of natural organic matter in the water. And in the long pond water supply, and by the way, this is not unusual, you'll see 2 or 3 or 4 milligrams per liter of total organic carbon in the water. Some of that organic carbon, by the way, is removed through the slow sand filtration system, and some of that organic carbon is also going to be removed going through the green sand filters due to the exposure to the oxidants in the oxidative media. And then there'll be a certain amount is left over, and that's where we get into the reactions that can form disinfection byproducts. But to put this in a perspective, we have organic carbon in the water at a level of parts per million, but we have parts per billion. So we're talking at least 2 orders of magnitude, if not 3 orders of magnitude differential there. So that's why this is a bit of a tricky issue and can be a problematic issue to resolve. So, coming in at 100 to 1,000 times the concentration it's allowed to be in the water at when it's treated. Next slide, please, Jim. So we're just completed a study of the Mass DEP asked Housatonic Water Works company to evaluate reducing the water age by lowering the storage tank level. Now, as I said before, the longer the contact time, the greater the potential to form disinfection byproducts. I mean, that's a basic working concept. So the state said, you've got a 1 million gallon storage tank and you're using a little over 100,000 gallons a day. The simple math says you've got about, you've probably got a 9 to 10 day hydraulic retention time in the storage tank. So can you lower the level in the storage tank? So this evaluation was done by members of the team, and the conclusion was that, and this is pretty readily apparent, lowering the water level in the storage tank below where it currently operates, it will of course decrease the water age. That's inherently obvious. However, it will also adversely impact the water pressure in the system, because keep this in mind, that storage tank is what they call a standpipe tank. So the water level in the tank, the higher the water level in the tank, the higher the pressure out in the water distribution system. And and obviously there's hills in the system area, but when you get to the top of the hill, it's the elevation differential between the level of the pipe top of the hill and the water level in the water storage tank. So if you start lowering the level in the water storage tank, you're going to start losing pressure out in the system. And of course, there's minimum pressure requirements that have to be maintained. Okay. The nominal rule of thumb and requirement, if you go below 20 pounds pressure, that's considered to be a dewatered system, which could trigger having to take corrective action. So the evaluation made a determination that from a practical standpoint, although lowering the water level in the storage tank might reduce the water age by a few days, it was going to have a much more adverse impact on distribution system pressure. So we felt that wasn't a truly effective thing to do. I would also add that, and we don't have a slide to present this, but the pilot plant included a disinfection byproducts evaluation, and we specifically evaluated the formation of disinfection byproducts over time in the finished water. And the reality is that once you got out past 2 or 3 days, you didn't have much of an increase in the disinfection byproducts concentration. And that's because it's ultimately limited by, among other things, the concentration of the organic materials that actually will react to form disinfection byproducts and the concentration of the chlorine in the water. And so my assessment is it's rate limited by the organic carbon content in the water, or the natural organic content in the water of specific species of the organic material. But we're continuing to evaluate this. That we just submitted a report yesterday to a Mass DEP, and in about another couple of months, we have to have a further evaluation done as far as looking at alternatives for improvements or modifications to reduce disinfection bioproducts. So that's an ongoing effort. That's another outcome of, in part, the pilot plant, as well as other initiatives that are being pursued. So that is being addressed also, and it's being done in full cooperation and transparency with Mass DEP. So, Jim, next slide, please. So that sums up the presentation, and I realize that folks may have questions, and so folks, anybody who's got a question, I'll do my very best to answer it.
We've had a couple of people that had their hands up for quite a while. First, we'll go to Jill. Jill, you're allowed your access now if you'd like to ask your question. You could unmute, Jill. We'll go back to Jill and Annie, you had a question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi.
Yep.
So Ann O'Dwyer here, 26 Kirk Street in Housatonic. I'm wondering if you could go back to the pilot plant results slide. I wasn't really able to follow all of that. Yep, don't know the one, no. Right here, yeah. Could you make the slide, you can hit view to make it larger because I can't read anything that's on the screen. Okay. And so down here at the bottom are the dates, right?
Right.
And what are the dates? I'm sorry, I just can't read anything there.
Those were
All right.
September.
If you want, I can respond there, Jim. The first day of the pilot plant was September 14th of this year, of 2022.
Okay.
We ran the pilot plant continuously through September 28th. So it was we ran it for actually 14 or 15 days consecutively.
Okay, great. And
Okay.
then these dots that seem to be right on the x-axis, what are they about? Hello?
Oh, that's the manganese concentration in the treated water. Okay, and so that's a combination of both the field test results as well as the laboratory on that x-axis, which is the zero concentration line.
Okay.
Because in most cases, the manganese was either non-detectable or very close to zero.
Okay, so
Above it is the raw water coming in, or the influent to the green sand filter.
so the triangle, the sort of open or the white, the open triangles, those are what? The orange
That's
triangles there?
that's the manganese concentration in the water going into the green sand filters. And the
Okay.
triangle means it was a laboratory analysis, and the green dot means it was a field test analysis. Okay.
So,
So what
okay, yeah, sorry.
No, so as I was going to say, Ann, was that what you can see there is that, obviously in all cases we had, a somewhat elevated level of manganese, in excess of the water quality limit going into the green sand filters. And then when you look down at the treated water, we had zero to minimal concentrations indicating successful treatment. And that was, very far below the water quality requirement.
All right, so Bob, and I'm sorry, your audio goes in and out, at least for me. I don't know if it's just on my end, so I'm struggling to understand a bit. So
Actually, I have seen that a couple times. It's come up here that I've got a.
Yeah,
Yep.
So let me just, if I can just say what I understand, and I think I've got it. What we have with the green dots is the field water prior to being processed. What we have with the orange open triangles is the manganese levels in the lab tests prior to being treated.
That's correct.
What we have in these darker dots and some open dots that are closer to the x-axis are the manganese levels post-treatment.
That's correct.
Okay. So that is actually quite, and you had mentioned that there were some higher levels of manganese than at other times, and is that little dot in the sort of middle date that's a little bit higher than the other dots, not the green ones, because those are pre-treated, right? We know that. We know that there are spikes in manganese, so we're looking at the dots closer to the x-axis, right?
Yeah. There's that one dot right there above these.
Right.
The September 22nd, there's that one dark dot that's above the other treated water analyses. It's still below the point. It's a little we'd like, but that was in all likelihood that was related to some of those really high levels that were coming in, that we had in the raw water coming in.
That makes sense to me. Can I ask another question, or would you rather go to another question asker?
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Ann.
Okay, so, I guess I'm wondering, so the, DEP or other agencies are requiring you to do these pilot programs. Is that because water differs from source to source, and there's no way to know exactly what the results will be, and Housatonic Water has to demonstrate that works and is safe for this particular water? Or are these sort of surprising findings?
The short answer is yes, water varies from system to system and source to source. Number two, the second part of your question, the answer is yes. Mass DEP wants a demonstration that whether it was this process or any other process would work effectively for Housatonic Water Works Company. So absolutely. The findings aren't particularly a surprise, just for what it's worth, treatment systems in my career, but I've probably done 100 green sand filtration systems. And when you apply them correctly, they're fairly simple and very effective. They work very well. I would have felt confident putting in a green sand filtration system here without a pilot plant, but we have to go through the pilot plant process. Understandably so. I mean, we're not debating that we should do a pilot plant. The issue was simply that everybody wanted to have the confidence level that it would work effectively on this water supply, which I think has been demonstrated.
And when you did the field water samples, do you know where they came from? Did they come directly from Long Pond, or did they come from places?
Ann, could you,
I faded out. I couldn't quite hear Ann's question. I only heard part of it.
could you ask it again, Ann,
Oh,
please?
sure. I'm just wondering, yeah, sure. The field water samples, where did they come from? The pond or other places?
Are you asking?
All the samples for the pilot study were taken at Long Pond at the
At the
treatment
pond,
facility.
Okay, thank you.
All right, moving on. Jill, you still have your hand up? If you could unmute yourself. Okay, we'll move on to Susan. Please unmute yourself.
Got it.
Thank you.
So what you talked about, implementing measures that would reduce the level of HAA5 and the other material that you talked about. Do you have a sense of what the timeline is for implementing measures that are going to reduce these two byproducts of the chlorination?
Well, we have to have an engineering and process study done and submitted to Mass DEP in approximately months from now.
I'm sorry, you broke up. I didn't hear you. How many months from now?
We have to have a study into Mass DEP in about 2.5 months, give or take a few days. And from that point, that is going to lay out the recommendations for action. Okay, it's going to have to be laid out as the evaluation, the findings, and the corrective action plan. And from that point, following review by Mass DEP, that's going to lay out the action plan for Housatonic Water Works Company. I can't sit here and tell you exactly what the findings and recommendations are going to be because we still have work to do on that. But that's going to be occurring in a relatively near-term scenario. We're under basically we're under a consent. The system's under a consent order. They have to move forward and want to move forward. And so is in about 2.5 months for the engineering evaluation and submittal to the state.
So once that is submitted, of those evaluations and recommendations, will that work then start immediately? I'm trying to get a sense of how long are we talking about as we're talking about all of these potential.
Better position to answer the question than I am.
I think regarding the pilot study, once that's approved, we would like to get that in process as quickly as we could. And I know the DEP at this point is looking for a full year study. If we can persuade them with this data that we did the study during the high season and do a second season like the winter season, we like to have it in process for the summer prior to.
So your expectation is that you will begin to implement some sort of remedy for this by the beginning of the summer?
Again, once the regulatory process is approved, if the
DEP were to shorten their timeframe.
If they were be able to shorten their time frame, we would have something up and running for the summer. It would be, we can run it outside during the summer, then we do have to put a building up to run this, permanently. But our goal is to not have everyone go through another summer with the discolored water issues.
Okay, thank you. And Bob, you stated that long-term exposure of these elements is the problem, not a one-time. I think many of us think that we've been consuming this for long-term. So can you define what you mean by long-term at the point when this does become a health risk?
Well, the way it's defined, simplistically speaking by the EPA is they call it lifetime exposure. Obviously, you'd rather have zero exposure. I'm not going to suggest otherwise, but again, the potential health risks are not based upon, say, a single time consuming some water, which might have elevated disinfection byproducts. I also want to point out the water does not always have elevated disinfection byproducts. It's happened periodically. Okay. It's not like it's a chronic situation that's occurring every day. It just occurs periodically because we have variable conditions, let's call it variable environmental conditions that can affect, say, the organic material load in the water coming from Long Pond. Okay. And plus, again, seasonally, in the winter, your organic carbon tends to go down quite a bit. It'll tends to go up in the late spring, because that's when you've got a lot of material being generated, and then if you get a lot of rain, it gets into the pond. So it's a variable load that comes in, and then of course it doesn't all react. A fraction of it reacts. So, but the state and the waterworks company, their goal is 100% or as close to 100%, effectiveness as possible as far as being in compliance. That's the obvious goal for everybody.
Okay. And this may be a very simple question, but you talked about in the slide when you were talking about lowering the level of water in the tank would cause us, while the water wouldn't age as much, but we would be losing water pressure. Why not use smaller tanks that would provide less than 9 days of water, but would allow us to use the water before it ages so much that these contaminants become a problem?
I think I could answer that for you, Susan. 25, 30 years ago, we put the tank in. It was based on the current usage at that time, and we're using about 300,000 gallons a day. That was prior to metering. And at that point, we went to DEP and we requested that we base it upon the meter anticipation of what the metering would do. But those were the rules. You had to build for 3 times your daily flow. So it was 1 million gallons. Once we put the meters in and have done more and more leak detection and tightened things up, our flow is down to 1/3 of that. So consequently, we have an enormous amount of water at the ready, but it's also being a challenge for disinfection byproducts. And the reason why the tank was put at that height at Long Pond was to alleviate the high areas in the center of town. 30 years ago, we had a pumping station on Prospect Street, another one on High Street. So once those were eliminated, it's based upon the hydraulics of the tank up at Long Pond. So we decreased that water inside the tank there. We're concerned that people are gonna have lower pressure, and worst case scenario, as Bob said, if you get below that 20 PSI, it becomes a real situation for health and safety.
Right. So from what I understand, from what you just said, when the original recommendation was made or requirement was made for the level of water that you needed to have to service the demand, we're now at 1/3 of that, right? So wouldn't a smaller tank make sense since our usage is down so much?
Well,
And would then not allow the these contaminants to interact with the organic materials in the water because it will be there for less time?
that would be a goal, sure. But these tanks, they're not something you just pop up, and they're very expensive. One of the other things that we're looking at, and we've talked about this in the past, is doing a second tank in the core of town, and which would be a smaller tank, which would have the water at the ready if there's an emergency. And also between the two tanks, we could adjust the chlorine levels and try to address it that way. Bob and his team at Northeast Water Solutions there is also working on other alternatives to reducing the disinfection byproducts, which may include putting lowering the level going into the tank and adding it somewhere in the center of town or on a main distribution line to again alleviate the issue with the disinfection byproducts. Those are all things we're looking at.
Okay, that's my last question.
Thanks. Eric.
Thanks, Jim. Just a couple questions. The feed was pretty glitchy in the beginning, so you might have addressed this, but I was having a hard time understanding. So I guess I'm just curious. The DEP originally requested a 1-year test of this whole system, correct?
Correct.
And so you shorten it down to a month in September in hopes that will satisfy them.
No, actually, the first phase was in September. The first phase.
First phase.
Yes.
Jim, if I could elaborate a bit there.
Bob, you're
DEP
Bob, we can't hear you that well.
request a year-long. Try a few things here. Can you hear me a little better now? Is this any better?
Yeah, that's better.
All right. They asked for 4 quarters, okay, 4 quarterly tests. We've had excellent results in the first quarter. We'll be starting to set up to do the winter quarter. We're going to see, because the results have been so good, we'd like to or the waterworks company would like to move forward with implementation based upon the results, because we have no expectation that there's going to be any, adverse results. This is a very, very consistent treatment process. It's been proven in tens of thousands of applications worldwide. And we feel very confident that will work. We've got in many other applications in Massachusetts. Other firms do use the same process. It's widely used. So Housatonic would like to speed up the schedule from what Mass DEP has requested. So we're going to see the performance of the pilot plan.
So, yeah, I guess you say high season in September. That makes me nervous. I think most people experience the truly dark iced tea coloration, in the spring and in the middle of summer. So I'd just be curious. I think all your results would be significantly different then, but just was curious if we were going to be testing in those months. That's all. I understand it's a 100-year system, or this green sand's been around for about 100 years. So I understand what you're saying. I guess I was just would be concerned. And then it's just a matter of, how does it know to come to the places that experience that more regularly than when it doesn't, right? When it leaves the place, depending on which way the crow flies, a lot of customers experience the manganese or discoloration differently, right? So I guess that will still have to be sorted. Not guaranteeing that the green sand's going to sort everybody's problems, but you're saying it's going to result in the water leaving the facility in a better form.
Yeah, that's correct, Eric. In the water, due to solids in the water, for a variety of reasons. Some are based on the distribution system hydraulics. The goal of the treatment process is to optimize the quality of the water going into the system. Obviously, you've also got to look at what's happening in the distribution system. As I said, hydraulics are a big factor. Okay, and now a hydraulic evaluation was done recently by another engineering firm, and in fact, just as recently as yesterday, we resubmitted that to Mass DEP. That's part of our response. That's part of the backup information relative to looking at the examining and evaluating the issue. Can we lower the water level in the storage tank? So just keep that in mind. The first order of business here is we want to minimize, if not eliminate, manganese in the water going into the distribution system. Once you do that, now you've got a better opportunity to improve the water quality in distribution, because you're not continually adding more into the system. So that's the first part of that.
Right.
That's the goal of this immediate project.
Thank you, Eric. Eileen.
Hi. On the slide showing the before glass of water and the treated glass of water, or the present glass, right? Where and when were those taken?
If I recall correctly, they were taken. Well, we took water glasses, samples, cups of water virtually every day. Okay, I believe that was taken in one of the first few days, that particular photograph. Okay,
That's correct.
Where did the water come from? I know it came from Long Pond, but did it come from Long Pond directly or from somebody's tap?
No, all the samples were all taken at the treatment plant.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Annie.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
When?
In September 14th or 15th.
Okay.
Great, thanks.
Hi, yeah, I have a couple of questions. Do Housatonic fire hydrants currently have sufficient flow to effectively combat a severe house fire?
That's a tough question to answer, Andy, because I don't know what parameters you're looking at.
Well, I'm talking about, you see the size of, maybe not the big houses on Main Street there, but the average Housatonic house, if it were to catch on fire and be a big fire, would there be enough flow or pressure to combat it?
Because there are so many different size lines throughout town, it's hard to be specific on that, but there's sufficient volume in the majority of hydrants. If you have something 4, 6, 8-inch line, there's sufficient pressure. We did do a pressure study, a flow test study, which I can send you a copy of, that showed samplings of pressures that are indicative throughout the town, and we're going to use that to in the future to do up a report on what lines should be upgraded in order to increase those flows. The real situation is you have a lot of real estate right in the core of town. And to have the water in the core of town instead of dragging it from Long Pond is really important. And one of the things we're looking at is putting a 500,000 gallon storage tank in the core of town, which would address not only the water needs in case of fire, but also aging water. So those are things we're looking at.
Is that the same tank you were referring to before?
Yes, we have some land up on High Street there where there was a tank before, and we're looking to put something up there.
So am I getting this right? You said the tank that you have near Long Pond is about 1 million gallons, is that right?
Correct.
And that we currently use about a third of that?
We use less. We use 107,000, 110,000 gallons a day.
So the 500,000 tank that you're putting on, that you would put on High Street, is that what you said, would actually be sufficient for the whole town, would it not?
Again, hypothetically it would, but there's a lot of hydraulics that need to be done, and also analysis on usage and how we would integrate that all into a larger plan. But that is one of the things that we are looking at.
And in terms of the, you said the big tank, they're very expensive, these tanks. Can you give an estimate about what they cost?
The tank that we have at Long Pond is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 or $5 million at this point.
And what about this 500,000 gallon tank?
That's a little bit less. It's probably $2.5 million.
Okay. That's all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Liz.
You knew about the manganese problem for a year ago, and even before that. Why didn't you do this test for the manganese at the height of the problem this year instead of in September when the problem supposedly should have been less?
Well, let me answer that at least partially, Jim. My understanding is that you did have there were a number of complaints earlier in the year, in the spring and summer about discolored water. Monitoring data of the water coming from Long Pond, we actually have, our analytical work is actually demonstrating a higher level of manganese was coming in September than actually had been typically monitored earlier in during the peak season. The historical data for manganese in the raw water showed a maximum concentration of about 0.34 milligrams per liter of manganese in the raw water. We actually measured manganese as high as 0.8 and 0.9 milligrams per liter. So we have to understand that there's different factors that impact the water discoloration that can be happening at the point of use in somebody's house out in distribution. As I said earlier, the objective here was to maximize the removal of manganese, at, so to speak, at the source to optimize the water quality going into the system. And as I said, our monitoring work, and again, this is all going to be submitted to DEP. It's going to be very transparent, but we actually were surprised to some degree because we knew we were getting into what should have been the latter part of the peak season, but the manganese levels were actually higher, as high or higher than had been historically identified in the water. So regardless of the fact that we did this work in September, we had some fairly elevated manganese coming in. So just keep that in mind. Now, again, other factors can really impact what's happening in the distribution system. And because you have solids, for example, that are within the piping system, and some of those solids, they can periodically get flushed out of the system or flushed through the system. They can break loose, or they can just move through a system, and suddenly you've got them at a given point of use coming in. There's a lot of factors, which is why maintaining high quality water, it's not just, are you treating the water going in, flushing, cleaning the tanks, things like, there's a whole host of things. If these are things that the water.
Thank you, Bob. Liz, did you have any other questions tonight?
No, one thing is I would like to know why this was not addressed in previous years. This has been going on for a number of years. And I've lived in my house for almost 50 years. And it was totally ignored.
Okay, thank you, Liz. Janice.
Hi, so Janice Gildoy, 185 Christian Hill Road. So some people have already touched on some of the things that kind of struck me, but the first is the before and after picture. I guess I was surprised, if I'm understanding correctly, the before is after treatment, but before going through the green sand filter. I think most of us would be totally and utterly thrilled if our before water looked like that. And indeed it did not. And mine was bad and it was bad, but not the sludge that was experienced by many of the Housatonic Water Works customers. So I guess I'm a little thrown by the test being done in September and not being tested on more seriously adversely impacted water samples. So I guess that's the first thing. This isn't reassuring to me, because I would be thrilled if my water had been only that discolored. So the other thing is that, so I guess I would want to see more thorough testing also, but I understand a year is a long time. So I guess, is the test being done on more sludge-like samples? Some of the water that's been experienced by other customers. And I could, mine too, for that matter. I'm about fourth house from the source, I believe. And I guess my next question is, so the intention of this is to clean the water, filter the water before it goes into the distribution center system. However, my understanding is the primary pipe is at least 125 years old, maybe older. So we get this cleaner water being put into the distribution system, and then what?
I think I could answer that, Janice. We've done lots and lots of studies on this. There's been samples throughout the system, and the manganese is the issue that causes the color. The iron levels have been below. There's no indication that iron is making this color. So we're looking to do the treatment at the source and have, clear water going in, and that'll go throughout the entire system. Abby.
Didn't give me a chance to ask another question. I think he's done with.
Abby?
I'm sort of coming at this late, and my question is manganese simply a matter of color, or is it also not good for you?
From DEP standpoint, it's an aesthetic at the levels that we're seeing. If there are significantly higher levels, then there are health concerns. Of course, we don't like to have any color outside of clear, and we're working to do that, Abby.
Right.
We're
But
also trying to be
if my water looks like the water in the left-hand cup,
yeah,
there's no danger to my health. It's just not pretty.
correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I have a few people that emailed and texted some questions here. Let me just see what they are. Who sets the requirement and limits for chlorine introduction?
I can answer that. Actually, the US EPA sets the maximum chlorination concentration limit, which, by the way, is 4 milligrams per liter. However, there's also a calculation you have to go through to make it. There's again a formula originally developed by US EPA that has been adopted by virtually every state in the country to calculate the chlorine residual you have to maintain in a given system to achieve and maintain 4-log disinfection compliance. Okay, and again, that's very system specific. You know, the concentration required by system X is different than the concentration required by system Y. It's a unique calculation you do for each system. So, but it's all based initially on US EPA requirements as accepted by Mass DEP.
Very good. Another question, is the chlorine filtered out of the water supply before going to the homes in town? No, it's not. The key really is to have a chlorine residual of at least 0.2 at all points within the distribution system so that there's proper disinfection. And those, our water is tested independently twice a month. Those results are sent to the state to ensure that there is sufficient chlorine in the water. One of the challenges that we have being a system where you have the long on one end and you have the 16 miles of pipe, there are some dead ends at the other side of town, which are at the very, very end of the system. So you have to have a higher level loading at the front end in order to get that residual at the tail end. And that's why some people notice seem to have more chlorine than others do. I have another question here regarding what alternatives are there for disinfection without chlorine? Perhaps you could answer that, Bob.
There are other chemicals you can use. Most commonly, there's a lot of variants of chlorine. Okay. There's also there's a hybrid chemical called Myox, but that's probably 95% chlorine. That's you go through, you take brine solution, put it through an electrolytic reactor, and you produce about 95% chlorine and about 5% hydrogen peroxide. That the vast majority of the chemicals are derivatives of chlorine. So you're going to run into a disinfection byproducts issue. People have used UV sterilizers. The problem is that that's a point of use method of achieving a bacterial kill, but there's no residual benefit to that. So it doesn't help you further downstream. And many states don't even allow you to use those anymore. But having said that, there's chlorine gas, there's chlorine dioxide, there's sodium hypochlorite. There's a whole host of chemicals. You can use peroxide, but again, it's control of it is problematic. So there are some, like I said, there are some variants you can consider, but the standard used throughout the country has historically been chlorine or a chlorine derivative.
Great, thank you. I have another question regarding the DBP violations, and I just like to. They're wondering how often we've had violations, and the fact is that the water's been tested for DBPs for a long period of time. In 2021, we had a violation, so it's not something that's been tested continually, and the first violation was in 2021. I have a question from Matthew. Matthew, you're unmuted.
Yeah, good evening. Had a question to Bob. He mentioned chlorine dioxide. Now, instead of using the chlorine itself, do you have any experience with using that? From what I understand, it's a little bit less toxic, and you have any experience with that?
I don't have any specific experience with chlorine dioxide. It's again, it's not used that widely. It's been, it's been used in a handful of applications that, that I'm aware of. Okay. So I can't personally speak to that as far as any experience, direct experience that I have. Okay.
Okay. The second question I have is, and I had talked to Jim about, is the question of primary water, which needs to be drilled. It's not really any more expensive than other drilling for wells, except it does go down to the crust and can be fracked with dry ice, which would eliminate the need for chlorine or adding anything to the water at all. Now, I've experienced primary wells in California. They have them in Saudi Arabia and in Israel. And I know it's not many people know about it, but it would cure probably all of the problems that we're having. Are you familiar with primary water at all?
Well, I'm familiar with drilling for water. I've overseen the drilling of probably more than 1,000 water supply wells in my career. And what I can tell you is, although there's a much lower probability of getting things like total organic carbon or natural organic matter in a drilled, say a bedrock well, which goes into the, goes into the earth, into the bedrock material. You have a much higher probability or possibility of getting iron or manganese in the water, because that's a constituent in a lot of the bedrock that would have to be examined. So you don't necessarily eliminate all the problems.
Well, that wouldn't be primary water. That wouldn't be primary water. The University of Miami is the only lab in the country that tests for tritium, which that's found in all basin water and all water that's atmospheric. But if it doesn't have tritium, it's primary water. They have now understood that water is actually manufactured in the earth. The H2O is manufactured there, and there is nothing in the water at all. And the way that the University of Miami can test it is by testing it for tritium, because all tritium is found in basin water and any underground or above water. You can go to a site that's called primarywaterinstitute.org, and you can look at it there. And they also have a magazine with all of, the studies and everything that's in there. And it's actually completely pure. You wouldn't have to add, anything to purify it. There's nothing more pure than primary water.
Thank you, Matt.
You're welcome.
Next question is from Peter. Peter, you're unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So when you have a filter in your own home, you're told to change it every once in a while, presumably because the things that are being picked up are accumulating. So I'm assuming that this green sand eventually has to be changed and replenished, no? And if so, where does the old stuff go?
All right. The green sand filters are a granular media filter. And when they've captured and accumulated enough particulate material, they have to be backwashed. Okay. And you can control the operating cycles and therefore the material captured in the filter based upon a number of different variables. You can look at differential pressure. You can look at something like turbidity in the filter, the finished water coming out of the filter. You can look at gallons treated. There's a whole host of alternative variables you can use, but you backwash the filter. Basically, you reverse the flow of water through the filter. You lift the bed, you fluidize the bed, you wash the solids out. That spent backwash water, in this case, would be discharged to a lagoon system where ultimately the solids would be separated out and the water would infiltrate back into the ground. So you're right. We're not changing out the backwash, the green sand media every cycle. We are backwashing it to flush out the solids. When you have something like a cartridge filter, say in your house, or even possibly a bag filter, you have to change the cartridge periodically because once it's fouled, you have no means, say, to backwash it or otherwise clean it. The solids have penetrated the filter media, whether it's a cellulose filter or a wound filter or whatever. That's why you have to change it out. With granular media, as I said, you backwash them, and that's how you restore the capacity. Now, all filter media beds periodically have to be replenished, either to replace normal attrition losses, or in the case of green sand, we typically recommend you replace the entire filter bed about every 5 to 7 years. That's more of a routine. That's a preventative maintenance, methodology. And again, you have to look at site-specific conditions and assess the frequency of changing the entire bed.
Right, so now so this lagoon system, that's something that has to be constructed then also, right? And that, I have no idea how big something like that is, or how it affects the whole landscape, or I have no idea what that involves.
Well, that's a system that would be down at the treatment plant. In fact, that's why we did an extensive backwash study of the filters as part of the pilot plant, so we can assess backwash water and solids generation, so we can properly evaluate what the needs would be for something like that.
Right, but even if you have a lagoon system, the accumulation of stuff that has been gathered for however long, it still has to go somewhere.
Well, again, the solids are going to be captured,
Okay.
and then you have the water that ultimately recharges back into the ground.
Mhm.
That's what happens. Okay. You might go through a settling tank or a sedimentation basin to settle out a lot of the, manganese oxide solids, which are, relatively, they're heavier than water, they're particulate solids. And then the water continues on and ultimately recharges into the ground.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We had another question regarding the operation and the expense. What's your experience with the expense of running a green sand filtration?
Again, it's very site and system specific, but green sand filtration systems tend to be have a lower operating cost, say, per gallon of water treated or per 1,000 gallons of water treated, because it's a relatively simple process. In this case, it doesn't, right now we'd be operating it within the context of the existing system and the existing chemistry. So it's a comparatively small incremental addition to the operating cost. Obviously, there's a capital cost, but again, it's a very efficient process compared to if you tried to use, say, a membrane treatment system, or you tried to use a precipitation and flotation separation process or something like that. This produces a much more discrete, solids in the backwash water that separate readily. It's got a relatively small footprint. It's a highly efficient process. So, as for example, we piloted this up to 7.5 gallons a minute per square foot. You get into a lot of your more conventional sand filtration processes, you're operating them at 2 or 3 gallons a minute per square foot. So you need a much larger system. And the larger the system, the more expensive it is going to be to construct it and then to operate it. So again, it's very site specific. I don't have exact numbers to give anybody right now, but it's also it's a very cost effective and cost competitive process relative to removal of manganese.
Thank you. We have just a couple more questions, and one is regarding the disinfectant byproducts, and the question is there a filtration system you could put in that you would not have to use chlorine?
One of the alternatives here, and in fact, this is something that we're looking at as part of the disinfection byproducts evaluation, And I have to say, I haven't discussed this in detail with Jim yet, but you can, as a substitute for chlorine, you can use potassium permanganate. That's actually the original oxidation chemistry used with green sand. By the way, it's NSF 61 compliant. It's accepted for use throughout the United States and throughout the world. It's not a risk to people by any stretch of the imagination. So we have an alternative. However, if we use that associated with the green sand filtration, we would still have to do post-chlorination because we have to maintain 4-log disinfection. So we are looking at some options there. Okay, there are some possibilities, and again, the use of potassium permanganate is fairly widespread. Okay, as an alternative to using chlorine.
And again, this question is very specific. Is there a treatment that you can use to ultrafiltrate where no chlorine would be needed after the filtration? Anywhere in
No. Short answer is no.
Right.
Ultrafiltration is a membrane filtration process, just like whether it was ultrafiltration or microfiltration. And using filtration, that's a solid separation process. It has to be a particulate solid to remove it, to prevent it from passing through the membrane. Therefore, you have to go through, typically you go through an oxidation process or other chemical precipitation process. And the risk you run is that if you don't, any of them, in this case, manganese, that you don't oxidize and or otherwise precipitate, it will go through the membrane and be in the finished water. And that's one of the advantages of green sand, is you don't have to get 100% oxidation and precipitation of the manganese up front before the filter, because the filter bed itself, the filter media, has a catalytic oxidative capacity. That's why we use either chlorine or permanganate for the oxidative chemistry. It keeps the filter media in an oxidative state. So if you have some amount of dissolved manganese coming into the filter, it will be oxidized on the media and filtered out. That's the advantage over membrane filtration. And membrane filtration has a lot of other chemical requirements because they typically need a lot of cleaning. I've designed and operated membrane filters, and they can work, but they're a lot more expensive in capital. They're a lot more expensive and complicated in operating cost. And you have to oxidize and precipitate virtually 100% of the manganese, or it's going to go right through.
Very good. Thank you, Bob. Just checking to see if there's anything that just came in. Seeing none, thank you, Bob, for the presentation, and thank you everyone for tuning in. At the height of the meeting, we had 58 attendees, and at the end tomorrow we'll be posting the PowerPoint presentation on our website, and as soon as we have the other data from Bob, the reports of DEP, they'll be on our website as well. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, and good night.